Davos 2026. For 3 days in January, the world's most powerful leaders gathered in the Swiss Alps and said, out loud, what most had only privately acknowledged. The rules-based international order is over. 6 major addresses. 1 shared conclusion. Von der Leyen of the European Commission spoke of building new European independence. Canada's Mark Carney described a rupture, not a transition. France's Emmanuel Macron warned of a world where international law is trampled underfoot. China's He Lifeng called on the world not to return to the law of the jungle. What ISAR Global has been systematically documenting for 2 years was confirmed in a single morning by the leaders of 4 of the world's most consequential power centers. Carney's address was the most significant. He acknowledged what most leaders have refused to say. The rules-based order was always partially false. The strongest powers exempted themselves when convenient. Everyone else participated in the rituals, placing the sign in the window. His conclusion was unambiguous. This bargain no longer works. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. A transition implies eventual return to stability. A rupture implies permanent structural break. That distinction matters enormously for every governance framework built on the assumption of recoverable multilateral order. The shared diagnosis did not produce shared solutions. Each actor's response was determined entirely by power position. The United States moved toward great power unilateralism, demanding territorial concessions, threatening allies with tariffs, abandoning rhetorical commitment to multilateral norms. In practice, AI standards set through market dominance, not international agreement. The European Union chose trade bloc resilience, building the world's largest free trade zone whilst pursuing strategic autonomy, exporting regulation as a condition of market access. Middle powers, led by Canada, adopted variable geometry coalitions, issue-specific groupings rather than universal frameworks, recognizing that if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. And China made a strategically significant pivot, championing the rules-based order at the precise moment the West chose to abandon it. 4 actors, 4 responses, each internally coherent, collectively incompatible. The most revealing signal at Davos 2026 was not what was said. It was who chose not to attend. Denmark and Greenland, the primary subjects of Trump's territorial demands, both declined to participate. Denmark's Prime Minister Frederiksen addressed her own parliament instead. Greenland's Prime Minister Nielsen spoke from Nuuk. Both invoked international law. Neither sought the Davos platform. When sovereignty faces direct challenge, affected states exit multilateral forums and prioritize national institutions. The implication for AI governance is direct. States whose digital infrastructure or data sovereignty faces external pressure will follow the same pattern, exiting frameworks, prioritizing bilateral agreements, and treating multilateral participation as discretionary. Within hours of the addresses concluding, the pattern those speeches had described was validated in real time. Donald Trump announced a framework deal on Greenland, negotiated with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. Denmark was not present. Greenland was not present. A framework determining the future of their territory was negotiated without the affected parties at the table. This is not an anomaly. It mirrors US-Russia frameworks on Ukraine's territorial integrity, negotiated without Ukrainian participation. Great powers negotiate. Affected parties are presented with predetermined outcomes and asked to ratify them. Four realities now confront policymakers engaged in AI governance. First, the harmonization fantasy ends. Universal AI frameworks will fragment into variable geometry coalitions. Data sovereignty, model safety, infrastructure access, and enforcement, each developing separate negotiating configurations determined by power, not principle. Second, infrastructure sovereignty becomes operational. Carney's warning that bilateral negotiation with a hegemon equals structural subordination applies directly to AI. States hosting critical systems on US-controlled cloud infrastructure face acknowledged governance vulnerability. Third, enforcement diverges from rhetoric. Great powers will advocate for AI transparency and safety standards whilst maintaining national security exceptions that exempt their own capabilities. Middle powers face enforcement without reciprocal protection. Fourth, and most consequential, process intelligence becomes essential. Carney acknowledged the order was always partially false, but those who recognized this earlier were able to position for rupture. Systematic tracking of what AI governance mechanisms actually deliver versus what they promise creates decisive strategic advantage that no retrospective analysis can replicate. ISAR Global's assessment is direct. Davos 2026 marked the moment leaders stopped pretending. Variable geometry is now the operational reality of international governance, not a future risk, but a present condition. For those navigating AI policy, four conclusions follow. Harmonization ends, infrastructure, sovereignty matters, enforcement diverges, and process intelligence wins. Understanding what governance mechanisms actually deliver, not what they are designed to promise, is the only analytical foundation that survives the rupture Carney described. ISAR Global, the Institute for Strategic AI Research Global, independent intelligence on governance reality versus governance rhetoric, isarglobal.org.